Sweethearts, a Short Story by Christopher Wynn. May ducked under overly burdened branches, crouching low to the handlebars of her rusty red bike. An incoming pile of cow dung forced her to swerve off path, the uneven ground rattling her whole body and making the loose bike parts sing. The party responsible lowed forlornly at her as she pedaled past and swerved back on path. She clicked her tongue at his visible ribs and unenthused voice. He twitched his ragged ears in reply. Diamonds of sunlight imprinted themselves in her eyes as she looked up daydreamily from the seat of her bike. The sky darkened perceptibly as she continued, not with night but with pollution, more gray than blue. Wilderness transitioned abruptly into pavement, and she sheared the roadside to avoid a truck. It honked maniacally, never tapping the brakes. She remained in the margin, cutting a rubbery skid mark through the shucked corn that had been placed in the street to dry. She paused to exchange pleasantries with a congregation of ancients huddled around a game of sidewalk checkers. The onlookers stroked downy beards and kissed shriveled cigarettes. The players did nothing but stare at the board, black pupils glinting with concentration. She rode on, past pool halls that smelled of warm beer and restaurants that were really just roadside grills. Her stomach complained at the latter, but the lightness in her pockets drove her onwards, towards endless vacant apartments that marred the horizon. In all likelihood, they would be allowed to stand for a few years and then be bulldozed to be built again. She listened to the hammer blows which emanated from their interiors, and wondered if one of them was struck by a certain muscular arm. Home was a concrete cube divvied into 3 sections, an entrance, a sleeping quarters, and a kitchen. She set her bike inside the front door and entered, careful to slip off her shoes and exchange them for a pair of worn plastic slippers. She cast an affectionate glance at grandfather, napping in the corner on a cool surface of old newspapers, and collapsed on her mat, massaging her pregnant belly with just the fingertips. She felt reassured by movement within, and closed her eyes. Mother woke her with a sing-song voice as she passed through the sleeping quarters into the kitchen. She carried a gallon jug of water which swished and slushed pleasantly. This she placed on the countertop before bending down to select a large metallic bowl from beneath the sink. Situating it next to the jug, she turned to the opposite end of the kitchen and cracked open a makeshift freezer. She lifted a series of plastic bags to her far-sighted eyes, returning those that she did not desire to the ice, while gripping those that suited her fancy between her fingers. Satisfied, she pushed the freezer door closed with her shin and returned to the metallic bowl. To it she added the contents of the plastic bags, various meats and vegetables, intermixing each ingredient before dousing them with the jug of water. Glug, glug, glug. May watched her from the floor, a faint smile playing on her lips. She removed her hands from her belly so that she might push herself into a sitting position. As soon as she had achieved this position, the hands returned of their own accord to form a fleshy protective cradle around the bulge. One of them eventually fluttered up to her eyes to rub away the recent sleep. Seeing that May was awake, Mother began to talk as she prepared the meal. Mrs. Zoe was sick again today, so guess who worked a double shift? Mother shook her head. I don't know how much longer they'll let me fill in for her. They've threatened to cut back for months now, and the sick ones will be the first to go. Eh? Said Grandfather drowsily from the corner. Mrs. Zoe? An old flame, Mother mouthed teasingly to May. Mrs. Zoe was a schoolmate of Grandmother's, Grandfather pondered. She is still alive? Yes, Grandfather, Mother said exasperatedly. You are not the only member of the old generation who still graces us with their presence. Grandfather pursed his lips. Were Mother and Mrs. Zoe friends? May asked Grandfather quite innocently. Quite the opposite, Grandfather exclaimed. They hated one another. Well, said May, glancing covertly at Mother, perhaps some handsome young rogue introduced jealousy into their friendship. Grandfather puffed out his chest proudly. Perhaps. Speaking of handsome young rogues, Mother interjected, where is that impoverished impregnator of yours? Mother, May chided, he is hard at work in the new apartment complex. And I suppose he'll be wanting dinner tonight, Mother asked rhetorically. Well, he can have it when we see some of that money he promised. Mother turned her back, placing the metallic bowl on an open flame. Grandfather fished in his pocket for a pack of cigarettes. You know, he said, Mother was born in similar circumstances. Believe it or not, there was a time when I was, well, not so respectable as I am today. Oh, asked May. Grandfather shook his head. I was just like your fiancé, better at making babies than money. He brought a cigarette to his lips and commenced the search for a match. The first and only time I ever stole was to bring Mother there some scrawny apples. She looked like a little bird inhaling a worm. He discovered a match and struck it. They went unnoticed, but I felt so bad, that's when I decided we were moving to the city. We hopped on the backboard of a truck and held on for dear life. Grandmother was sure the fumes from the exhaust would kill Mother. 60 miles later, we hopped off here in Tianjin. Zhang tossed his hammer to the floor and wiped his face with his forearm. He accepted a canister of tea from Gen and drank vigorously. It was overstrong, but still refreshing. Some of it ran into his beard, a young man's beard, still wiry and unpleasant to the touch. He handed the canister back and began removing his gloves, tugging one finger at a time. Another long day, Gen commented. Like all the others, said Zhang. He dropped his gloves atop his hammer and set his hands in his face. I finally have enough. Eh? Money? Enough to buy formula. Her mother said the baby needs it. Really? Gen scratched his nose. How far along is it? 7 months, 1 week, Zhang recited. He lowered his hands and smiled. Soon I will hold him. Him? Gen asked incredulously. How do you know it's a him? Call it a father's intuition. Good luck to have a boy for a first child. Very. Zhang rose from his squat and stuffed his things into a knapsack. Gen continued to reflect, legs dangling over the beam. Want to go get drunk? Didn't you hear me? I've got to spend my pay on formula so my son will be strong. Zhang slung the sack over his shoulder. And get away from there. If you fall, they will think I pushed you off. Gen waved a hand good-naturedly. Zhang stopped by the humble flat he and Gen shared, carefully hiding his knapsack underneath a pile of dirty clothes in the corner. He then selected the last plum from the bottom of a bowl and popped it into his mouth, chewing happily and making it last as he made for the main road. He tried hitching a ride but was ignored. Shrugging, he resolved to walk, stretching his already aching legs and gritting his teeth. He tugged a white flower from a forlorn little bush as he passed, rubbing its silky petals appreciatively between his thumb and forefinger, as his hesitant walk developed a steady rhythm. He said an absent but polite greeting to those he recognized, which was everyone, and dropped a crumbled petal every few blocks. He shielded his eyes to better see the factory, imagining May behind one of its milky windows. Mother, May said during dinner, setting down her chopsticks, it hurts. She motioned to her belly. No, Mother said. It is too early. She motioned for May to continue eating. Just ignore it. Zhang judiciously selected 2 bottles of formula, sweating a little at the price. He checked the glass of the bottles for leaks. He compared their weights and expiration dates to a 3rd carton to determine if they were equal. Satisfied, he placed them in a grocery basket and headed for the register, palming the precious paper bills in his free hand. May screamed, knuckles white against Grandfather's arm. A series of pulsating contractions seared her lower body. I don't understand, Grandfather said, blank-faced. It's premature, said Mother. Grandfather, she looked him in the eyes. I need to find the midwife. Keep her awake. Grandfather nodded, blinking back tears as he lowered his face to May's and whispered reassurances. What happened? Asked Zhang from the doorway, wide-eyed and clutching the bottles. Grandfather shook his head defeatedly. Mother wiped sweat from her brow as she looked up from May's unconscious form. Her water broke early. The midwife was away. She breathed deeply, looking haggard. I did what I could, but there is... Her glance flickered to the bundle lying beside May. something wrong. Zhang went to the floor, dropping the bottles, and made his way on hands and knees to his fiancée and child. He cupped May's cheek tenderly in his palm and shuddered at its coldness. Then, with trepidation, he took a hold with thumb and index finger, the lip of the cloth which obstructed the child from view, and gingerly drew it back. The room swam before him as he slid closer to examine the deformities. The baby looked not quite human, with a hydrocephalic head and palsied limbs. "Oh my God," Zhang breathed, sitting back onto his heels. Grandfather clasped the young man by the shoulders as the color drained from his face. Zhang murmured to Mother, "Will he live?" Mother shrugged, wiping the blood from her hands with a towel. "If he stays here, no. If he goes, maybe." "Goes?" Zhang asked numbly. "To the orphanage," Mother clarified. "They have a Western doctor there. Medicine." Zhang cupped his mouth, momentarily sick. "Is this because of me?" he eventually asked, voice cracking. "Because I took too long to buy the formula?" Mother bit her lip. Grandfather shook Zhang consolingly. Nonsense. "He doesn't have much time," said Mother, beginning to rise. Zhang looked up, eyes still vacant, but with a hint of color returning to his face. "Tell me where to go." Gen shrunk back as Zhang held out the bundle to him. "It's just a few steps further. They'll see him from the gate." Gen shook his head. "I don't think I can do this." Zhang cursed. "And you think I can?" "All right," pronounced Gen, sounding unsure. "All right." He took the infant in his arms and peeked around the wall. Seeing no one, he carefully slipped the small bundle through the bars of the gate before hitting the buzzer. "It's done," Gen yelled. "Run!" He took off, only to pause a few paces later as he realized Zhang was not following. He ran back, seizing his friend by the shoulder. "Come on, right now." Zhang cast one last despairing look at the bundle lying just inside the orphanage gate, then flung himself in the opposite direction. When Zhang returned, he found May staring at the ceiling, stupefied. She did not stir as he entered and knelt beside Grandfather and Mother. "But how will we know," she whispered, "that he is all right?" Zhang leaned over her, wiping away the cold sweat from her brow. "We'll just know," he lied. "Parents always know."